Okay, hi everybody and welcome to our presentation. I'm Aurora and today Isabella and I will be talking about the colonial roots of counterterrorism. So the readings that we're looking at today are genealogies of terrorism, revolution, state, violence, and empire. The second is pre-crime and counterterrorism, imagining future crime. The third is colonial state terror in Puerto Rico, a research agenda. And the fourth is managing dangerous populations, how colonial emergence has occurred. So here we have the order of our readings and kind of our presentation structure. We're going to begin with colonial state terror in Puerto Rico. So this reading examines political violence committed by the US against Puerto Ricans through the lens of terror-based colonialism. As the author notes in their introduction, they intend to show how state political violence and terrorism were used in the colonization of Puerto Rico to legitimize US colonialism and to control and demobilize Puerto Rican anti-colonial movements. So that was a quote from the introduction of the reading. They emphasize that in order to adequately analyze the conflict, it is necessary to consider the multifaceted nature of colonialism and its various forms and implications. The author examines state terror as a manifestation of colonialism through the notion of the colonial state of exception. So in order to demonstrate their argument concerning the use of terror-based colonialism by the US, they divided their article into four main sections. So the first provides a historical overview of Puerto Rico's colonial past. The second analyzes the US and the colonial state of exception. The third discusses colonial state terror. And the final section specifically delves into the US's use of colonial state terror throughout Puerto Rico's past. So as the author notes, these four sections are meant to contribute to the overall understanding of the complex relationships between concepts such as colonialism, political violence, law, and the processes of depoliticization. Essentially, the author seeks to examine the colonial state of exception and how it has led to the normalization of emergency situations. The state of exception is the key concept examined throughout the reading as the author looks to identify its origins and its long-lasting implications. They consider how colonial powers are using and manipulating colonial emergency procedures regarding state of exception to pursue political agendas and suppress anti-colonial movements. So I'm going to give my analysis on the reading and then Isabella will follow. So I think the concept of the state of exception is interesting and important in studying counterterrorism policies. In the case of Puerto Rico, I find its boundaries concerning citizenship interesting. American citizenship was imposed upon Puerto Ricans despite pushback from American and Puerto Rican politicians, yet they were not awarded the basic rights of citizenship that those in America were given. Specifically, Puerto Ricans were not given the right to vote for Congress or the president if they did not choose to move to the United States. So the reasoning, therefore, providing citizenship was not to give Puerto Ricans military protection, but rather a tool to further control the Puerto Rican population and assume greater power over their mobility and standard rights. The state of exception was damaging for the Puerto Ricans, especially since it continues to be manipulated by the US and Puerto Rican governments to control the population. And as I mentioned in my summary, suppress anti-colonial movements. So what is so interesting to me about this is that while the United States is critical of suppressing regimes in other countries, they're rather hypocritical as they are committing the same or similar offenses regarding the suppression of specific populations. Some anti-colonial movements in Puerto Rico are violent and illegal, yet legally conducted movements are also being monitored and suppressed. The US and Puerto Rican governments are censoring the rights of Puerto Ricans who oppose the colonial structure of their laws in the name of counterterrorism, which in my opinion should not be legitimized.
So for my analysis, I very much agree with Aurora in the way that it's fascinating that the author invokes the concept of the state of exception and how Puerto Ricans are not given the same rights as other American citizens. And this is, again, mostly due to counterterrorism efforts and how it's easier for the US to subjugate the population of Puerto Rico to its will and crush any anti-colonial movements as they are not afforded the same due process as other American citizens. And for me, it continues to astound me that Puerto Rico is still subjugated to this colonial rule on behalf of the United States and how they are not afforded the same basic democratic rights as being able to vote. And again, as Aurora said, this is very hypocritical as the US is seen as the epitome of democracy. And for me, I wonder if this could be a limit to the state of exception. For the next reading, I will examine the genealogies of terrorism, revolution, state violence, and empire. specifically chapter 4, which deals with terrorism and colonialism. So in this reading, the author uses the example of colonialization of Algeria by France in the 19th and 20th century to demonstrate how counterterrorism measures have evolved. Specifically in the 19th century, France colonized Algeria by using traditional methods in order to solve France's internal and external troubles, most notably the decrease of its reputation as a leading power and the internal elements that were deemed undesirable, such as an abundance of criminals. Conversely, in the 20th century, France used these colonial methods in Algeria to maintain order and defend society against national groups attempting to decolonize Algeria, which they deemed as acts of terrorism. Through these uses of state violence, though these uses of state violence look similar, the 20th century methods were instituted under different circumstances and for different reasons, most notably in terms of counterterrorism. The author uses the term polemic terrorism to demonstrate how the concept of terrorism was transformed into a new kind of war, or in other words, understanding terrorism in terms of war. She demonstrates how the deployments in international law by which terrorism became embedded within legal norms for dealing with political crimes across national borders. In turn, this new concept of terrorism, polemic terrorism, required new concept of counterterrorism methods used in the 19th century. For instance, the use of torture as a means of intelligence. However, she demonstrates that most of the information gathered through torture was not useful, and thus the torture was used as a way for the colonial power to subjugate the native population, who were in their eyes an extension of the nationalist movements. So I will say my analysis and then Aurora will do hers. Overall, I think the reading was very interesting and informative, and I appreciate how the author invoked the term polemic terrorism to demonstrate how the concept has evolved to be treated in terms of war. However, I do believe that the author repeats a lot of their arguments, and perhaps they could be said in not so many words. Firstly, it was interesting to see the evolution of counterterrorism methods from the measures used during colonialism, most notably the use of torture to ensure the submission of the Algerian people. Also, use of the us versus them dichotomy to justify counterterrorism efforts. You see that the author demonstrates that with the example of Algeria, but you can also see that today with the continued efforts of profiling Muslim communities.
Okay, so I largely agree with Isabella on the fact that the author repeats a lot of their arguments, which at least for me kind of took away from the overall impact of the chapter. However, it was interesting how the chapter continued to build into chapter 5 and to see how methods of counterterrorism have been used and manipulated over the years. One component that I found rather interesting is the discussion surrounding torture as a means of intelligence. Despite torture proving to not be an effective method of intelligence, colonial powers continued to conduct torturous interviews on the native population of Algeria to assert their control and domination over the Algerians, using colonial justifications regarding counterterrorism. This concept kind of relates to the article we'll be discussing shortly on pre-crime and how counterterrorism measures are essentially laws against laws. So from a human rights perspective, torturing specific populations in the name of intelligence is very much illegal and immoral. The justification is that the emergency measures and counterterrorism laws are in place due to security risks, and therefore the torture is justifiable and legitimate, which I disagree with that notion. So the next reading we're going to be discussing is managing dangerous populations. So I will start with my summary and then we will do our analysis on it. So this article argues that the central goal of counterterrorism policies is not safety measures against the war on terror, but rather to gain and maintain population control. So they look at how counterterrorism policies rooted in colonialist tendencies are manipulated and utilized by governments. Specifically, Berta looks at how mobility restrictions, surveillance, and other counterterrorism emergency measures are used by legitimacy-seeking regimes to maintain their title of a democracy while infringing upon the privacy of their citizens at the same time. This is a significant danger as governments can target specific populations under the guise of security laws. Berta discusses these notions through the historical foundations of security legislation and citizenship and examines the cases of Israel and India. So Berta begins by discussing the introduction of security laws In this section, they argue that 9/11 was not the introductory point for the stripping of rights by security laws. In fact, existing emergency policies rooted in colonial attitudes and policies were used. So the author introduces the cases of India and Israel and how Britain created emergency security measures and how they've been manipulated by the former colonies upon achieving independence. They consider various security measures implemented by Britain and then India and Israel, ranging from the 19th century up to 2016. In essence, Berta argues that arguing legislative activities of Israel and India are part of global war on terror, ignores the colonial roots of the legislation, and ignores the use of these laws by governments to pursue their own political desires. In the case of Israel, the government used emergency procedures to integrate racial discrimination into legislation. Most pieces of these legislation specifically target Palestinians, as in the case of the implementation of Israel's 2016 counterterrorism law. As Berta states, this has led to an extremely precarious situation for minorities because citizenship can be revoked for security reasons as determined by the government. In India, boundaries of citizenship are technically universal but can be manipulated for certain groups. Indian security measures are implemented based on the axis of suspicion. Therefore, while the government and police forces don't target those of specific ethnicities, race, or socioeconomic status, your occupation who you associate with can place you at different points on the axis. So you're ranked as loyal, active collaborators, or suspects and enemies of state. This is an example of blacklisting, which is essentially a bureaucratic method, according to the author, used to justify administrative detention, forced expulsion, and surveillance. So in the case of India, where you are on the axis determines your level of suspicion, which in turn can justify emergency security practices. Overall, the main argument or takeaway, in my opinion, is that British colonial measures have been weaponized by India and Israel to pursue political agendas unrelated to the global war on terror. They're using these colonial laws to discriminate against specific minority groups or to monitor those who oppose the government in power. The origin of these laws was not in response to the global war on terror, but rather Britain's desire to control the populations prior to the colonies achieving autonomy and independence. So I'm going to start with my analysis and then Isabella will follow. So one of the key points I focused on in this reading was the application of emergency procedures to suit political motivations and the lack of regulations concerning the state's power to do so. In my opinion, citizenship is a key component of someone's identity, and it's therefore concerning that it can be so arbitrarily taken away or undermined at the discretion of the government without significant justification other than colonial legislation awarding the government the right to do so. I think that these colonial laws present a significant issue concerning counterterrorism policies, as the policies did not originate with counterterrorism strategies, but rather with the colonial desire for population control and political power by colonial states such as the US, with Puerto Rico and Britain with India and Israel. So these counterterrorism policies are rooted in prejudices and manipulated to give states absolute power over their citizens. A key example of this is the concept of blacklisting, which was briefly mentioned in the summary. I found this component interesting as it delved into the specific means and justifications for targeting certain groups and minorities. I particularly found India's axis of suspicion interesting because it deviates from our traditional ideas of concerning prejudice and counterterrorism. Blacklisting is corrupt and legitimacy-seeking states are typically thought of as suppressing specific minority groups based on race and gender. At least that's how I've kind of typically thought of it. But the axis of suspicion is interesting because it isn't inherently racist, but rather uses occupation and associations as a basis for surveillance and detention. So it kind of expanded my understanding of the different ways that these security measures can be manipulated to suit political means. So not only attempting to suppress minority groups, but to monitor individuals potentially conspiring against the regime.
For my analysis, I very much agree with Aurora. And for me, it was very fascinating how the argument of counterterrorism laws have been arbitrarily applied to different populations deemed as dangerous in India and Israel. And I think this argument can be applied to Canada in relation to its treatment of the Indigenous population. Specifically, if you look at the protest at the pipeline or the Oka crisis and how they applied military tactics to deal with those. I also think that this article invokes thoughts of Nazi Germany, in which Jewish populations or populations deemed as dangerous or individuals or groups who spoke out against the regime were ostracized or in other words, labeled and monitored, and they were thus deemed as suspects and therefore labeled enemies of the states. Okay, for the next reading, I'm going to look at chapter 5 of Genealogies of Terrorism, Revolutions, State Violence, and Empires. And this chapter is entitled Reimagining Terrorism at the End of History. So, the author would like to argue that the US counterterrorism efforts after 9/11 were a reworking of French counterterrorism efforts in Algeria. More specifically, she applies the term synthetic terrorism, in which the present day counterterrorism measures are used by the United States have stemmed from the conversions of systemic doxastic, ideatarian, strategic, criminal, and polemic terrorism. Furthermore, she argues that counterterrorism efforts have evolved from defending a specific society or nation from an external or internal threat to defending humanity as a whole, and that 9/11 was an occasion to implement a legal paradigm of executive prerogative and reshape the future according to the United States vision. She then applies the concept of synthetic terrorism to the idea of citizenship and humanity. The author argues that synthetic terrorism finds its roots in the emergence of neoconservatism during the 1970s in the United States, as it promotes the expansion of American values and free market economics by any means necessary, including military force. She argues that this process was expedited by the so-called 9/11 resolution, where, in the name of self-defense, national security, and the protection of U.S. citizens at home and abroad, the president was authorized to take any action, whatever, against anyone suspected of aiding and abetting terrorism. Through the examination of the rise of synthetic terrorism during the years of 1987 to 1993, she argues that synthetic terrorism is best understood as an effect rather than the cause of a particular political interest whose realization depends on techniques of power. When applying this argument to citizenship, the author argues that citizens and terrorists are reciprocal and incompatible. She invokes the example of the Boston Marathon bomber. I'm sorry if I mess up this name, Zakar Tazanov. Yeah, anyways, you know who they are. And to demonstrate how the response to white terrorists is to individualize their actions and prosecute them through legal means, whereas non-white terrorist actions are seen as acting on behalf of a collective. Here, under the pretext of terrorism, their actions tend to trigger an expansion of state power as well as collective punishment of certain communities in the form of racial profiling and increased surveillance. Similarly, when relating synthetic terrorism to humanity, she argues that human rights cannot be separated from terrorism. Instead, it is a functional requirement of an effort to universalize particular, most notably American values as requirements of human dignity. Additionally, she argues that counterterrorism efforts have produced a humanitarian norm in which individuals labeled as terrorists are identified as subhuman. Thus, the practices of detention and torture are justified as these individuals are socially constructed as not human. Furthermore, she argues that synthetic terrorism has legitimized illegal violence and wars of aggression waged by the West under the pretext of defending society and humanity against terrorist threats. So, for my analysis, I think it was really great how the author built her arguments off of the last chapter. And again, it was very interesting how she used the concept of synthetic terrorism to demonstrate how the concept of terrorism has evolved to become an amalgamation of the previous variations of terrorism. Most notably, how the US has managed to frame the fight against terrorism as defending humanity as a whole. And thus, by framing it this way, the US was/is able to insert the influence on a global capacity and take action anywhere in the world in the name of counterterrorism. In terms of applying the concept of synthetic terrorism to citizenship and humanity, it was very thought-provoking and allowed for a better understanding of the term. And I very much agree with the author when she states that white terrorists and non-white terrorists are treated differently in terms how they are dealt with, i.e. through the judicial process versus the expansion of state power. However, I never much considered how white terrorists are dealt with on an individual basis, whereas non-white terrorists are always seen to be acting on behalf of the collective. And a prime example can be the shooting at the mosque in Quebec versus how, say, the Pulse nightclub shooting was treated. Also, I think The framing of terrorists as subhuman to justify torture and detention was a very amazing example, and it also applies to the state of exception, and it comes into play in which these terrorists are no longer treated as human because they have gained the label of a terrorist.
Concept of synthetic terrorism in regards to citizenship is the notion that citizenship and terrorism are incompatible. So the author notes that individuals seen as terrorists are disidentified as citizens and discusses the various implications of to race. I found this argument extremely interesting in that for individuals who committed a crime and are processed through the traditional criminal justice system, whereas for non-white individuals committing terrorist acts, it's seen as a targeted act of a collective and therefore justifies the government's actions of surveilling certain groups. I think substantial examples of this would be the reaction to the storming of the US Capitol versus 9/11. There are obviously extreme differences in the number of lives lost and the global impact, but I do think it's interesting how following 9/11, the US's counterterrorism laws targeted Muslim communities and was used to justify invading another country, the invasion of Iraq, while legislation has not necessarily changed to be prejudiced against the type of people who stormed Washington, despite their intention to commit harm and the fact that it was an extreme attack against the political system of the United States. So that distinction is just very interesting to me. And like Isabella said, it was very thought-provoking. So finally, we're looking at the reading on pre-crime and counterterrorism. So we're kind of going to do this one a little bit differently. So I'm going to give my summary of the reading, and then Isabella is going to kind of provide a counter argument to the author's points, and then I'm going to argue for the author's arguments. So this article examines pre-crime through counterterrorism policies and practices. The authors argue that the counterterrorism policies operate outside the realm of traditional pre-crime policies, and they discuss the implications of that. While counterterrorism practices are rationalized through the argument that preventative measures are necessary for the benefit of the better good, the authors emphasize that counterterrorism measures operate outside of conventional crime prevention. Incorporating the concepts of national security and criminal justice indicates a significant shift. The authors argue that there's then an overlap between the state's internal and external coercive capacities. That was a quote. The article examines the tensions that arise because of this and identifies various aspects of this significant change to traditional criminal justice practices and policies. The authors begin with this section on pre-crime and a new paradigm in prevention. So they explain how the concepts of pre-crime and preempting threats continue to expand due to counterterrorism legislation that have significantly developed in response to 9/11. So they aim to distinguish the differences between crime prevention and pre-crime measures. The argument is that crime prevention includes, this is also a quote, non-punitive measures that reduce opportunities to commit crime or address the broader context in which people commit crimes. Whereas pre-crime or counterterrorism criminalizes those who are believed to be plotting to commit future crimes. Essentially, crime prevention targets the root cause of crime, while pre-crime measures ignore important social and environmental contexts. As the article continues, the authors criticize how the term terrorist is applied preemptively and warns against the counterterrorism frameworks. And they distinguish that the term can only formally be applied through judicial processes, where the term terrorist is applied by the public and politicians. And they discuss the flaws associated with that. Later in the article, they use the statement first, verdict after, sorry. Later in the article, they use the statement sentence first, verdict afterwards, and discuss the moral and legal components of this using the example of Guantanamo Bay. Regarding the counterterrorism framework, the authors warn against the traditional structure of counterterrorism policies, which combines criminal justice and national security. They argue that the two concepts have contradictory frameworks, which blurs the boundaries of counterterrorism practices. Counterterrorism legislation is counter laws. Essentially, they are laws against laws that eliminate traditional components of criminal law. It's also important to consider the role of police forces in counterterrorism policies. They increasingly have adopted the national security's perspective that involves the gathering of intelligence. The authors then argue intelligence versus evidence and highlight that pre-crime measures mobilize prejudice and lead to increased politicization of policing and law. This is more evident in totalitarian regimes rather than democracies due to their use of colonial power. The hybrid nature of counterterrorism policies involving criminal justice and national security encourage repressive measures involving detention and torture within democracies. So essentially, this article argues that pre-crime measures are based on stereotypes and prejudice rather than concrete evidence. So counterterrorism strategies merge law enforcement with the military and national security, which lead to the connection between politics and violence. And finally, a key point of the author is that the term pre-crime highlights the problematic nature of counterterrorism policies, and pre-crime indicates that no crime has been committed while simultaneously seeking to conjure the crime that has yet to occur.
So for their arguments for pre-crime measures, I think it's important to identify threats before they happen because it's pretty simple math. You can identify them and therefore save lives. And obviously you can put limits on the rights of privacy in the name of national security to again save lives. For instance, you can monitor those who visit ideologically motivated sites and try to rehabilitate them before they take significant action. For example, if the government of the US were to monitor the people that went on to QAnon sites or sites like that, perhaps they could have stopped the Capitol riots.
Okay, and now I'm going to give my argument, which kind of sides with the statements of the author. So first of all, I think that counterterrorism legislation is flawed in focusing on pre-crime rather than crime prevention. Current pre-crime legislation is ineffective in rooting out terrorism, so it needs to be asked kind of what the long-term goals or outcome of current counterterrorism measures looks like. I agree that it is important to identify threats before they happen, but I think that it is important to consider the nuances and various aspects of the counterterrorism laws. They need to be reformed to have specific guidelines or boundaries, as the current combination of national security and criminal justice leaves too many gray areas regarding the legal and illegal. Secondly, pre-crime counterterrorist measures operate on the presumption of guilt. It's interesting in comparing the term terrorist to criminal, how there's no judicial process to place the term terrorist on somebody. I think there should be more direct guidelines of what constitutes a terrorist. For example, what level of preemptive planning needs to be reached to consider somebody a terrorist. I don't necessarily have the answer to that, but I think that it is a concept that needs to be discussed. The authors provided an example of attempting to define a terrorist. In their article, they said that they gave the example of if you donate to a charity that is discovered to have terrorist affiliations, you potentially funded a terrorist operation. So does that make you a terrorist? And they kind of, explain that it's debatable, right? With such a complex idea of what a terrorist is with no set boundaries, it is easy for counterterrorism policies to be manipulated to engage in unnecessary surveillance and detention measures. So in this sense, it can mobilize prejudices against specific groups and undermine criminal justice practices. As noted in this reading, there's no proven science to discovering who is and isn't a terrorist. So monitoring based on race, ethnicity, or religion has proven to be extremely ineffective. So I just don't think that current counterterrorism laws regarding the monitoring of specific groups are effective. So now we're going to just go over kind of a consolidation of the author's arguments. So first of all, we're looking at the pre-crime measures. So emergency pre-crime measures were not introduced in 9/11, but rather have deep colonial ties. 9/11 just enhanced or exacerbated these measures on a larger scale, as it provided substantial justification for emergency security measures that target specific groups and populations. As demonstrated through the readings, this is not just to one nation, but rather universally by various governments, whether they're liberal democracies, emerging and legitimacy-seeking democracies, or authoritarian regimes. These deep colonial ties are demonstrated through the readings examples of Algeria, Puerto Rico, and Israel and India. Colonial powers such as France, Britain, and the United States have systematically incorporated colonial prejudices and practices into law and have used counterterrorism or security as a justification to do so. This has resulted in widespread concerns in the former colonies, as well as the colonial powers themselves, about the scope and effectiveness of counterterrorism and pre-crime policies.
So secondly, an argument that we found throughout all 5 of the readings is that the state of exception and other components of colonial emergency security legislation allows for the state to manipulate measures to suit its own motivations. This is most notable in the application of citizenship. We saw that in the readings, most specifically in Puerto Rico readings and the one with India and Israel, and also the transformation of terrorists from humans to subhumans, which ultimately justifies extreme human rights abuses such as torture and unlawful detention. Furthermore, pre-crime measures allowed for, again, significant human rights abuses in the name of state of exception, i.e., again, surveillance, detention, and the presumption of guilt without the proper judicial process. And then lastly, the discussion questions. So we decided to focus on two main themes. So firstly, according to, I'm going to mess up this last name, but Arlen Bush Anderson, the concept of citizen and terrorist are incompatible. And you can find that quote on page 52. Do you agree or disagree with this statement? Secondly, do you believe that the state of exception should be invoked in the name of counterterrorism? And if so, what limitations, if any, should exist? Thank you for listening to our presentation, and we hope to engage with you in the discussion board.